The year was 1917. The world was engulfed in the First World War. Europe trembled under cannon fire, while the Atlantic Ocean had become an arena for an invisible yet deadly struggle. German submarines, known as U-boats, hunted the merchant ships that carried vital resources to the Allies. In this tense atmosphere, the Canadian port of Halifax played a crucial role. Located on Canada's eastern coast, it had become an important hub for forming convoys, groups of merchant vessels that crossed the Atlantic under military escort, delivering cargo to Europe. Security remained the top priority, as German submarines could sink any ship traveling alone. It was at this very port that on December 6, 1917, an event occurred that would go down in history as the most powerful explosion before the advent of nuclear weapons. Halifax in those days was remarkable for its activity. Its port welcomed hundreds of ships daily, carrying everything from food to weapons. In December 1917, convoys were being prepared there to depart for Europe in support of the Allies in their fight against Germany. The city lived its normal rhythm, and none of its residents even suspected that an ordinary winter morning would turn into a catastrophe that would leave thousands of casualties and destroyed neighborhoods in its wake. At the center of the future tragedy was the French cargo ship Mont-Blanc. From the outside, it looked ordinary against the backdrop of other vessels that filled Halifax harbor. However, in its holds lay cargo that transformed the ship into a true floating bomb. This event became a tragedy due to its horrific scale and a series of human errors that could have been entirely avoided. To understand how an ordinary morning at the port led to catastrophe, one must first understand the context of events. The First World War forced the Allies to mobilize resources to the maximum. Canada, as part of the British Empire, actively supported the Allies by supplying weapons, ammunition, and raw materials. Halifax proved to be an ideal location for this. Its natural harbor allowed dozens of ships to be safely accommodated, and the narrow strait which connected the port to the open ocean held strategic importance. However, this strait required special caution. The narrow channel, surrounded by mines and anti-submarine nets, demanded extraordinary precision from captains and pilots. In those times, crossing the Atlantic alone meant almost certain death. German submarines mercilessly hunted merchant ships, inflicting enormous losses. To minimize risks, the Allies developed a convoy system. Several merchant ships would depart together under the protection of warships, including gunboats. Mont-Blanc had arrived at Halifax precisely to join one of these convoys. Its final destination was the French port of Bordeaux, where it was to deliver cargo for the war against Germany. But what exactly was this ship carrying? Why did its appearance in Halifax mark the beginning of inevitable catastrophe? To answer these questions, we need to become more familiar with the ship itself and its extraordinarily dangerous cargo. The French cargo ship Mont-Blanc had a displacement of 3,121 registered tons and appeared modest among the hundreds of other vessels that sailed the Atlantic during the First World War. Its cargo transformed an ordinary ship into a floating bomb of enormous destructive power. In Mont-Blanc's holds and on its deck was stored 2,300 tons of picric acid, a powerful explosive used for manufacturing shells. Additionally, the ship carried 200 tons of trinitrotoluene, or TNT, 35 tons of benzol for armored vehicles and tanks, and 10 tons of gun cotton. The total weight of this deadly cargo exceeded 3,000 tons, creating a gigantic floating grenade. Only the port authorities of Halifax and the ship's crew knew about the contents of the holds. Secrecy was critically important. The cargo was intended for the French army and was to be delivered to the port of Bordeaux for the fight against German forces. The strictest safety rules were in effect on board. Sailors were categorically forbidden to smoke, light fires, or use matches or lighters. All smoking materials had been confiscated back in New York from where Mont-Blanc had arrived. Picric acid posed the main threat due to its chemical instability. Combined with benzol and TNT, it formed an explosive mixture that surpassed most explosives known at the time in power. Gun cotton, or nitrocellulose, added even greater danger, easily igniting and capable of causing a chain reaction. Even the smallest spark could trigger an explosion capable of destroying the ship and everything around it. In 1917, the war in Europe consumed enormous quantities of ammunition. France, as a key ally, needed constant supplies of explosives for artillery and other weapons. Mont-Blanc was among many ships that risked their lives crossing the Atlantic to provide the front with necessary resources. However, its cargo was distinguished by exceptional power. The port of Halifax was preparing to send another convoy to Europe. The ship was to join a group of vessels that, under the protection of gunboats, would overcome the dangerous waters patrolled by German submarines. This mission was vitally important, but at the same time deadly risky. Mont-Blanc's crew consisted of experienced sailors who understood their responsibility. Captain Aimé Lemedec understood that his ship posed a potential threat to anyone who came near. Pilot Francis Mackey, who was to guide Mont-Blanc through the narrow strait to Halifax Harbor, also knew about the deadly cargo. Their goal was to safely navigate the ship through the port and join the convoy. None of them could foresee that the next few hours would lead to a tragedy that would forever change Halifax's history. The next stage of this story unfolds on the morning of December 6th, when two ships, Mont-Blanc and the Norwegian steamship Imo, would find themselves on a collision course in the narrow strait. The morning of December 6, 1917, in Halifax dawned clear and calm. The sunny weather created an illusion of peace, even though somewhere in Europe war was raging, and in the North Atlantic, German submarines were hunting merchant vessels. In Halifax Harbor, work was bustling. Dozens of ships were preparing for departure or arriving to form convoys. The Narrows, a narrow channel between the harbor and the open ocean, served as the key passage for all vessels. This morning was meant to pass as an ordinary working day, yet a series of events in the channel would forever change the city's fate. The French ship Mont-Blanc stood at anchor in the roadstead, awaiting permission to enter the harbor. Captain Aimé Lemedec received instructions from port authorities and requested local pilot Francis Mackey to guide the vessel through the channel. Mackey had extensive experience and knew the peculiarities of the Narrows well. The waterway concealed dangers. On one side lay minefields installed for protection against German submarines, while on the other, anti-submarine nets blocked the passage. Maneuvering in such conditions demanded precision and caution, as any mistake threatened collision. Pilot Mackey was aware that Mont-Blanc carried explosives, making his task particularly critical. He navigated the ship at 4 knots, following regulations and keeping to the starboard side of the channel. Meanwhile, the Norwegian vessel Imo was moving from the harbor toward the open ocean. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, it weighed anchor and headed through the Narrows. The cargo steamer Imo, though carrying ordinary freight, also required careful handling due to its size and maneuvers. The Narrows had sufficient width for 2 ships to pass without problems, especially given the perfect visibility that day. International navigation rules, adopted in 1889, clearly defined the order of movement in narrow passages. Vessels were to keep to the starboard side of the channel, avoiding collisions. The distance between Mont-Blanc and Imo during their approach was 3/4 of a mile, quite sufficient for the captains to assess the situation and execute necessary maneuvers. However, the captains of both vessels, Aimé Lemedec on Mont-Blanc and the officer responsible for Imo, showed insufficient caution. Neither reduced speed, though the situation demanded maximum attention. Pilot Mackey on Mont-Blanc confidently guided the ship, but failed to account for Imo also maintaining course. Both vessels were approaching a turn in the channel where the waterway became even narrower. This location posed particular danger, as any error threatened collision. Navigation rules were meant to ensure safe passage, but human factors played a fatal role. The captains never coordinated their actions, which became the first step toward catastrophe. Why were 2 experienced crews unable to avoid danger? Perhaps confidence in the good weather or underestimation of the situation played their part. The fact remained unchanged. Mont-Blanc and Imo found themselves on a collision course. The next few minutes would prove decisive. The collision, which could have been limited to a minor incident, became the beginning of an incredible tragedy, due to Mont-Blanc's unique cargo. In the narrow channel of the Narrows, where ships were supposed to follow strict rules of safe passage, an event occurred that triggered a chain of fatal consequences. The French vessel Mont-Blanc, heading toward Halifax Harbor, met on course with the Norwegian steamer Imo, which was moving toward the open ocean. Despite perfect visibility and sufficient distance for maneuvering, the captains of both vessels wasted critical minutes, and no actions to avoid collision were taken. Around 10 o'clock in the morning of December 6, 1917, Imo crashed with devastating force into the starboard side of Mont-Blanc. This moment began a catastrophe that would enter history as one of the most terrible man-made disasters. The impact proved destructive. Imo's bow penetrated Mont-Blanc's hull 3 meters deep, crushing part of the deck and hold. Metal barrels of benzol stored on deck were damaged by the powerful blow. The highly flammable liquid began leaking in streams, flowing down the tilted deck and seeping into the lower compartments where picric acid was stored. The benzol created perfect conditions for the coming catastrophe. Every drop became a potential source of ignition. Emo's crew, immediately after impact, engaged reverse engines, attempting to reduce their vessel's destructive momentum and separate from the damaged Mont-Blanc. For a full minute, Emo's engines worked at maximum power to push the Norwegian steamer backward. When the ship's bow finally slipped from the gaping hole in Mont-Blanc's side, the friction of twisted metal against metal produced a shower of sparks. These seemingly small sparks proved deadly. They ignited the benzol spilled across the deck. Fire erupted with lightning speed. Flames instantly engulfed Mont-Blanc's deck and spread to neighboring fuel barrels. Tongues of fire began licking the wooden structures and penetrating toward the holds, where tons of picric acid and other explosives were stored. Each second brought the ship closer to the point of no return. Captain Aimé Lemedec and experienced pilot Francis Mackey immediately grasped the horrifying reality. Virtually no time remained to save the ship. The fire was gaining momentum with incredible speed, and the deadly cargo in the holds made any attempts to extinguish the flames suicidal. Every crew member understood the terrible mathematics of the catastrophe. If flames reached the main cargo, the explosion would wipe everything within several kilometers off the face of the earth. Captain Lemedec faced a choice among several desperate options. Scuttling the ship might stop the fire from spreading to the explosives, but the sea cocks, special valves for quickly flooding the holds with water, proved to be damaged. After long months of operation without proper maintenance, they had rusted so badly that opening them quickly became impossible. There was no time for repairs or finding alternative solutions. Fire was consuming the ship with every moment. Lemedec made the only possible decision. He ordered Mont-Blanc to be steered toward the exit from the Narrows, hoping the ship would manage to reach open sea or at least move away from the densely populated city. Simultaneously, he gave orders to the crew to prepare lifeboats for immediate evacuation, understanding that remaining aboard a burning ship loaded with explosives meant signing their own death warrant. The captain's decision had its logic, though desperate. He hoped that at maximum speed, Mont-Blanc could take on enough water at the bow and sink, which would stop the deadly fire. However, reality proved harsher than calculations. The fire spread much faster than the ship could move even at full speed. The crew, aware of the mortal danger, hastily prepared for evacuation, but time for methodical action was running out. The fire on deck was reaching catastrophic proportions. Thick clouds of black smoke were already rising high into the sky, attracting attention from shore. Events in the Narrows began to be watched by other ships and Halifax residents, still unaware of what catastrophe was bearing down on their city. The fire aboard the Mont-Blanc quickly spiraled out of control. The flames that erupted from sparks after the collision with the Emo engulfed the deck where benzene had spilled and began threatening the holds packed with picric acid, TNT, and gun cotton. Captain Aimé Lemedec faced a horrifying dilemma. Fighting the fire on a ship carrying such cargo meant risking instant explosion. Any attempt to battle the blaze could only hasten the catastrophe. Lemedec made the only sensible decision: to try steering the burning vessel as far as possible from densely populated Halifax and the other ships in the harbor. He ordered the Mont-Blanc to head toward the exit of the Narrows Channel, hoping to reach open water. At the same time, the captain commanded his crew to prepare the lifeboats for immediate evacuation. The sailors worked with desperate speed. The smoke grew thicker by the minute, and the fire relentlessly approached the ship's most dangerous sections. Some crew members lost their nerve. They jumped overboard and swam toward shore, understanding that every second aboard brought them closer to death. The cold Atlantic waters seemed a lesser threat than the burning ship that could explode at any moment. Meanwhile, the Mont-Blanc, engulfed in flames, became an ominous spectacle. Warships moored in the harbor noticed the thick smoke rising from the vessel. Halifax residents living near the waterfront also spotted the burning ship. For many of them, this sight proved both terrifying and mesmerizing. People began gathering on the shore to watch the unusual event. None of them had any idea about the Mont-Blanc's cargo or that approaching the waterfront could cost them their lives. To local residents, the burning ship resembled a rare spectacle that broke the monotony of their everyday routine. The crew hurriedly lowered the lifeboats, trying to abandon ship as quickly as possible. The captain and pilot Francis Mackey remained aboard until the last moment, hoping to steer the ship away from the city. However, their plan failed. Contrary to Lemedec's calculations, the Mont-Blanc stayed afloat, and the harbor's currents began carrying the burning vessel toward the Richmond Piers, the northern section of Halifax where other convoy ships were stationed. The worst possible scenario was unfolding. A burning ship loaded with thousands of tons of explosives was approaching the most densely populated part of the harbor. The military cruiser High Flyer, anchored in the harbor, spotted the burning Mont-Blanc and decided to intervene. The cruiser's commander, who knew nothing about the ship's deadly cargo, ordered a boat with sailors to render assistance. The sailors planned to throw a line to the Mont-Blanc and tow it away from the harbor into open water. The decision seemed logical, but catastrophically little time remained for its execution. The fire had already turned the ship into a blazing torch, and the thick smoke created an ominous picture over the water. The crew and the lifeboats hurriedly rowed toward shore, but the Mont-Blanc continued drifting toward the piers. The situation worsened with each passing minute. Halifax residents who had gathered on the waterfront remained completely unaware that they were approaching the epicenter of an impending disaster. The Mont-Blanc, guided only by the current, moved inexorably toward Richmond's wooden pier. The next few minutes would determine the fate of both the ship and the entire city. The events that unfolded after the burning ship reached shore would forever change Halifax's history. The flame-engulfed Mont-Blanc drifted toward Richmond's wooden pier, steered only by the Narrows Channel's current. The military cruiser High Flyer made a desperate attempt to save the situation. Sailors threw a line to the burning vessel, hoping to tow it into open water. Fireboats also arrived on scene, trying to subdue the flames, but their efforts proved futile. The fire raged too intensely, and the deadly dangerous cargo in the holds made any approach impossible. Little time remained for rescue. No one could steer the Mont-Blanc away from shore when what the crew had feared most occurred. The fire reached the explosives. A 100-meter pillar of fire instantly shot skyward above the ship, and in the next moment, an explosion of incredible force thundered forth. The Mont-Blanc disintegrated into thousands of red-hot fragments, and Halifax harbor plunged into pitch darkness. Thick, black smoke covered the harbor, concealing everything around it. The shockwave proved so powerful that it briefly exposed the bottom of the North Arm Basin. The explosion's force scattered fragments of the ship for kilometers around. The Mont-Blanc's half-ton anchor flew across the bay and landed 2 miles from the epicenter, while the ship's 4-inch gun was later found a mile from the city near Dartmouth. This explosion entered history as the most powerful before the advent of nuclear weapons, and every Halifax resident felt its destructive force. In the first minutes after the catastrophe, absolute chaos engulfed the harbor and adjacent city districts. Red-hot metal fragments, chunks of brick, and even rocks lifted from the seabed rained down on Halifax. Ships in the harbor suffered fatal damage or were completely destroyed by the shockwave. Richmond's wooden pier, toward which the Mont-Blanc had drifted, instantly burned up, and neighboring convoy ships sustained serious damage. In the city itself, the shockwave destroyed everything in its path. Buildings, warehouses, and port structures turned into piles of smoking ruins. People who had gathered on the waterfront to watch the burning ship found themselves at the very epicenter of the catastrophe. Many of them only glimpsed the flash before the explosion swept over them with a deadly wave. The scale of destruction was staggering. Where the Mont-Blanc had stood just a moment before, a boiling crater formed in the water, the only trace of the massive ship. The scattered ship fragments caused new fires throughout the city. The explosion completely destroyed the vessel and inflicted catastrophic damage on Halifax. The shockwave shattered windows in buildings for kilometers around, and the sound wave proved so powerful that it was heard dozens of kilometers from the city. For those who survived the first seconds, reality became a true nightmare. Thick smoke, sharp debris, screams of the wounded, and complete disorientation prevailed everywhere. People wandered among the ruins, trying to comprehend the scale of the catastrophe that had befallen their city. This explosion became a turning point for Halifax. It changed the city's face forever, destroying a significant portion of the harbor and leaving unhealable wounds in the lives of its residents. Halifax would never again be what it was before that fateful morning of December 6, 1917. After the Mont-Blanc explosion on December 6, 1917, Halifax was transformed into a disaster zone that would have been unimaginable even in the worst nightmares. The bustling port city instantly became a landscape of ruins, collapsed buildings, burning debris, and thousands of injured and homeless people scattered throughout the city. In the first minutes after the catastrophe, residents and rescue services fought for basic survival. Despite the chaos, Halifax's community, supported by the international community, began an exhausting marathon of recovery. Rescue operations started almost immediately, but the scale of destruction and the massive number of casualties created incredible obstacles. Fires erupted in different neighborhoods throughout the city, demanding immediate intervention amid a critical shortage of resources. Most hospitals suffered serious damage, and medical staff could barely cope with the flood of injured people. Approximately 10,000 people sustained injuries ranging from minor to fatal. Temporary hospitals were set up in any surviving buildings, but the lack of medicine and equipment turned treatment into a real ordeal. Volunteers and local residents who were fortunate enough to avoid injury rushed to clear debris, search for missing people, and provide first aid. Every pair of hands became invaluable in this race against time. The international community responded to the tragedy with remarkable speed. News of the Halifax explosion spread around the globe, prompting many countries to take immediate action. Donations began flowing into the city: warm blankets, tents, food, and other essential supplies. Support from neighboring regions of Canada and the United States proved especially powerful. Boston became a true savior, sending trains loaded with medicine, doctors, and various resources to Halifax. This gesture of mercy laid the foundation for strong ties between the two cities that remain alive today. Donations from other countries helped provide 25,000 homeless people with basic survival necessities, from food to clothing. The city's recovery stretched across years of difficult, exhausting work. The port, Halifax's economic heart, suffered catastrophic damage, forcing the rebuilding of the entire infrastructure practically from scratch. Destroyed warehouses, piers, and railway connections created a logistical nightmare, but gradually the city began returning to life. Residents who lost their homes lived in temporary shelters for months, and some remained forever scarred by the loss of loved ones or all their possessions. Alongside rescue operations, legal battles unfolded to establish who was responsible for the catastrophe. The first trial placed blame on Mont-Blanc's captain Aimé Lemedec and pilot Francis Mackey, accusing them of violating navigation rules. The French government categorically rejected this verdict, demanding a retrial. The second court confirmed Lemedec's guilt, although many experts pointed fingers at the British Admiralty. It was the Admiralty that authorized the entry of a ship with such explosive cargo into Halifax's narrow harbor, even though the Mont-Blanc could have safely waited at anchor until joining the convoy. Disputes about the true culprits continued for a long time, but for Halifax residents, they took second place. The main task was rebuilding the city and overcoming the consequences of the tragedy. The explosion left deep physical and psychological scars. Halifax, having survived one of the most horrific disasters in its history, needed many years to fully recover from this trauma.